Good evening and welcome to the second Scottish Hustings live from Glasgow. Last Friday it was the Constitution. Tonight the four main parties will take questions from our audience on the economy. But before we hear from them, here's a reminder of what the parties propose to get us out and keep us out of recession. The Conservatives' manifesto promises an economic environment that will encourage enterprise. They claim that membership of the exchange rate mechanism will help control inflation. They also say they'll keep a firm control of public spending, and they remain committed to cutting taxes as fast as is prudent. Labour claim they'll rebuild Scotland's economy with help from their National Investment Bank, and they say thousands of jobs will be created by their £1.1 billion National Recovery Programme. Training's a priority with the promise of a skills revolution, and they'll introduce their national minimum wage of £3.40 an hour. The Liberal Democrats have a clear promise to raise income tax by 1 penny in the pound to pay for education and training investment. They have an emergency programme to create 600,000 UK jobs in 2 years. Business rates would be frozen for a year, and they guarantee a training place for everyone out of work for more than 6 months. The Nationalists say they would create 200,000 jobs in Scotland in 4 years and introduce a national apprenticeship scheme. Privatised industries would be returned to public ownership, starting with the creation of a Scottish Steel Corporation. And they would set up a Scottish exports unit to boost overseas sales of Scottish goods. Well, those are the main planks of the party's plans for our economy. Here to take questions from our audience tonight are, for the Conservatives, the Scottish Secretary Ian Lang; for Labour, their Home Affairs spokesman Alistair Darling; the President of the Liberal Democrats, Charles Kennedy; and for the SNP, their party leader, Alex Salmond. Well, now let's get our first question of the evening. It comes from Audrey Brown.
Good evening. I would like to ask the panel this. If they find themselves in power after the election, what will be their immediate priorities to kick-start the economy and get us out of recession?
Ian Lang.
I think the first thing that will happen after the election, if a Conservative government is restored, is that confidence will begin to return. The uncertainty will be out of the way. And therefore I think the economy, the recovery which is poised to start, will begin to take off. But the first thing I would do would be to implement in full Norman Lamont's budget, with the help it brought for small businesses, with the improvements in taxation, and with the other measures to improve the supply side of the economy. I'm not sure about the phrase kick-start. That implies that some kind of violence is needed to generate growth. In fact, all the ingredients are there. We've got inflation halved, we've got interest rates down substantially. The recent surveys, for example, the Manpower survey, recently indicated that twice as many employers thought they would be taking on people in the next few months as would be reducing them. And the general consensus amongst surveys is that the economy is going to grow over the next 2 or 3 years by 2 to 3%. If we can get back into that level of growth and keep inflation at its present rate, then we'll resume the kind of expansion, the increase in employment and the growing prosperity that we had at the end of the 1980s, coming out of the world recession. So I don't think dramatic action is appropriate, and I would certainly fight very shy of the higher taxation policies or the spread of controls that the other policies are talking about.
This phrase that they use about the economy showing all the signs of being ready to recover, isn't it something similar to saying a man in a coma has all the signs of being ready to regain consciousness?
Well, the Scottish economy is not in a coma. Unemployment in the last 5 years in Scotland has fallen by 100,000. For every 4 companies there were trading in Scotland in 1979, there are now 7. There's a huge growth in the number of enterprises and activities in Scotland. They have suffered a bit because of the world recession, there's no doubt about that. But there has been continuing expansion. The latest employment figures published just the other day showed that there are 2,283,000 people in jobs. That's the highest number of people in employment in Scotland ever recorded.
All right, let's get an answer to the question from Alistair Darling.
I think confidence will return when the people who have caused this recession leave office in 2 weeks' time. I haven't the slightest doubt that many people have come to the view that this government, after 13 years, which started with a recession and have now managed to get us into the deepest and most sustained recession since the Second World War, have to go. John Major said he inherited the recession. Indeed he did. He inherited it from himself when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer.
What's your answer to the question?
Well,
what would Labour do? What would your immediate priorities be?
The immediate priority is to start to build sustained growth, which this country has not had for many years. To that end, we will make a major investment in training people, investing in the skills. We will allow companies to be able to get incentives to invest in capital, in research and development. Because unless we do that, unless we do what the Germans have done, what nearly every other successful country has done, we will be back back into the boom and bust cycle that has bedeviled this country ever since the Second World War.
All right.
Unless action is taken urgently, all that will happen if there is a slight recovery is we will suck in more imports and we will be in exactly the same difficulties as we are now.
All right, Charles Kennedy.
I think, unlike Ian Lang, that kickstart is the right phrase to use. I think that despite the electoral uncertainty, the recession is deeper and is going on longer than the government were prepared to admit, and obviously are willing to admit, excuse me, in the course of this election campaign. The specific measures we would do, first of all, unlike Labour, we wouldn't just accept the level of borrowing that Norman Lamont, the Chancellor, outlined in his budget. We would increase it by an additional £2 billion, and would use that money to target specifically construction-related projects, whether it's in health, whether it's in education, or in transport, because, excuse me, if you look at the profile of unemployment in this country, many of those currently without a job, the last time they were in work, was in construction or construction-related activity. And secondly, our other priority in that process, to make us more competitive for the single European market, would be, as you mentioned, Eddie, in your introduction, to use the additional £2 billion across the UK, 200 million in the Scottish context, that would be yielded by 1 pence in the basic rate of income tax to invest specifically in education and training.
All right, thank you for now. Charles Kennedy, in case it wasn't obvious to you, is nursing a cold this evening. So,
ever so slightly.
We'll allow him that. Alex Salmond, what's your answer to the question? What are your priorities?
Well, Ian Lang says that the Scottish economy isn't in a coma, but certainly the Scottish Secretary seems to be sleepwalking through the recession. If it was uncertainty that was the cause of economic problems, then surely the answer would have been to hold the election last year and get the uncertainty over. This recession is a direct result of the government's economic policies, and of course the Labour Party, as Charles Kennedy has pointed out, has accepted the constraints of the Tories' own budget, and therefore they're not going to make much difference. I think the questioner is absolutely right. Kickstart is the phrase that's appropriate, and you kickstart an economy by investing in the things that can bring an immediate input in terms of employment. That's construction, housing, training, to get the economy moving. We've also got to do in Scotland some of the things that are going to increase our competitive position in the long run. Research and development, investing in Scottish exports, doing what they do in the Netherlands and Japan. We've got an outstanding exports record in Scotland, but we've got so much more potential if we put the money in.
OK, you've all had a chance to outline your plans. Let's go back to the lady who asked the question, Audrey Brown. What did you make of that? Who's got the best plan?
I'm very happy, particularly with Charles Kennedy's opinions tonight.
Were you already happy with Charles Kennedy's opinions before he started speaking?
Not particularly, no, but they were well expressed. I'm very happy with what you said.
Despite the throat,
Despite
which was a
the
major
throat.
handicap.
All right, you get the sympathy vote tonight, but let's see if we have some more questions. There's a woman in the front row with her hand up in the black and red. Yes.
What concerns me is that the members around the table are talking, and those who are saying all the things they're going to do to get the economy of Scotland going, but personally, I cannot see logically how they can do that if they're immediately going to impose another level of tax coming from Edinburgh, which has got to disadvantage the economy of Scotland right from the word go.
All right, let's get. I'll let you answer in a moment. Let's have some more points and questions from the audience. The man third from the back with his hand up in the red tie. Yes.
As Charles Kennedy says, he would increase the public sector borrowing requirement by £2 million. But is it not the case then that would have to be paid for in tax in future years?
OK, Charles Kennedy, I'll let you answer that.
No, I mean, obviously, if you borrow more, you've got to pay it back. That's logical. But the fact is, over the course of this decade, and we have no finer authority than the indisputable voice of government itself in recent years, we have, in fact, been paying back money where many of us argued we should have been investing it, which would have helped us for the position we're now in. You do have to pay back any borrowing that you make, but quite frankly, on a 28 billion borrowing total, to add another 2 billion to that is not about to break the bank.
Ian Lang?
Well, one could go on all night talking about borrowing. The public sector borrowing requirement is at the moment about half the level in real terms that it was when we came into office. And we were the first government for a very long time that actually had a public sector debt repayment for a long time. So we've not only been balancing the budget, but we've been in surplus. I think in times of recession, it is sensible to have a borrowing requirement, as long as you have a planned recovery to balance as you emerge from recession. But can I make this point about the recession being made in Britain? It is absolute nonsense. Anybody who pretends that the sophisticated economies of the major industrialized nations of the world are not interdependent, is living in a very isolated time warp. The fact is that this is a recession that is affecting the United States, it is affecting Germany, it is even affecting Japan,
Well,
it's affecting Australia.
Can I pick you up on that?
is...
Can I pick you up on that?
Yes.
How many of those countries were experiencing negative growth last year?
Well, most of them are moving from high growth to medium growth.
We're moving from low
growth. We're moving from low growth back into growth. And in the 1970s, when Labour was in power, growth averaged 1% a year. Throughout the 80s, it's been averaging 2.5% a year, and it's expected to average 2.5% to 3% in the next few years.
You know that last year, those countries you mentioned, Germany, France, there's Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, and Japan, experienced growth of between 1% and 3.4%. And if you while Britain had negative growth of 2.5%. We're not all in the same recession.
If you look back, Eddie, but to the 1960s and the 1970s, you will see in the tables mentioning those nations that the United Kingdom was at the bottom of the growth league. Look at the 1980s, you will see we went to the top, or second from the top of the growth league. And that is what we will resume. Now, Alex mentioned exports. He wants to set up an export agency. We have actually already set up an export agency, but setting that aside, the fact is that the Scottish economy has remained relatively buoyant in relation to the United Kingdom because of our success in exports. And that is precisely the success that would be jeopardised if we pursued the high tax policies. The questioner in the front row was absolutely right. That would impose special burdens on the people of Scotland.
That's the question I want to come to you, Alex Salmond. How are you going to help the economy when many people believe an independent Scotland would be paying much higher taxes?
Well, I'm very glad. Let's just nail this canard straight away. We've got no proposals for higher business taxation at all.
No plans.
Well, we've set out exactly what our business tax proposals are, just like the other parties have. And we're going to reduce the surcharge that business in Scotland currently pay. I mean, Ian Lang talks about higher taxation. Business in Scotland currently pay 40% more than business equivalent in England and Wales through the higher rates charge. That's the existing situation. And any independent Scottish government is going to sort that out because we've got to ensure a competitive position for our business. Now, Ian Lang, of course, neatly avoided your question, Eddie, because he was asked why the recession was provoked. We led the world into recession in the United Kingdom because of Chancellor Nigel Lawson's mistakes back in 1988 and the high interest rate policy required to cool down the overheated economy of the south of England. Now, the point for Scotland is this, that no one in their right mind in 1988 or 1989, not even Ian Lang, would have claimed that the Scottish economy was suffering from overheating. And yet, despite that fact, we are to take the same economic medicine that was being prescribed for the boom economy of the southeast of England, and that's done tremendous damage to the Scottish industrial structure.
Okay,
that's one of the underlying arguments for Scottish independence.
The tax problem remains for you, doesn't it? There seems to be this flexible 3% tax band we could be talking about for Scotland in the event of you a devolved Parliament.
Yeah, I think that the tax problem is in the Tory minds because the Tories raised this spectre of an increased tax under a Scottish Assembly as one of the arguments against having a Scottish Assembly at all. I don't believe that any Scottish Parliament would put the income tax rate up by anything like that, except in exceptional circumstances, because obviously we've got to compete with the rest of Europe. We have to sell our goods in England. Our financial services industry, 87,000 people are employed by it, would be affected by such a move. That's absolute nonsense. But in any event, it really is a bit rich for Ian Lang to be lecturing us on economics when he's a member of the government that has brought us to the longest and deepest recession since the Second World War. Now, he mentioned planned growth. The government doesn't have any plans for growth. The government is just leaving things to chance. All the government is doing is borrowing money in order to bribe us with tax cuts. Right, now it looks as though those tax cuts are not working, but he certainly can't lecture us.
Let's go to the woman in the second row there with her hand up in the green.
I'd like to ask a very direct question about growth, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Given that gross national product measures all the goods and services in the economy and is therefore increased by waste and by indiscriminate use of scarce resources, don't the panel accept that it's a completely outdated measure of a country's well-being?
Ian Lang.
I think that sounds like a good question out of a PhD paper at Glasgow University.
What's the answer to it?
I'm not quite sure. But I think it is the recognised measure of an economy's product is its gross national product or its gross domestic product, which are broadly similar. And ours has grown dramatically through the 1980s at 2.5 times the rate of the 1970s. Not dramatically by comparison with Germany and Japan, but that is because they are low inflation, low taxation economies without excessive regulation and excessive bureaucracy. It may not be the perfect measure, but it's certainly the best measure we've got.
Okay, I want to go around the panel very quickly on this. Charles Kennedy.
Briefly, I think the question may come from an environmental standpoint, I suspect, because the Green Party obviously argue against economic growth in the way that, if one likes the parties represented in the panel here, would. I don't accept that myself. I think that there is room for what I would describe as green growth, which is a different measurement of growth, and indeed investment based on green growth. But I can't at the end of the day say to you that I would want to go onto a public platform here or anywhere else in the country and say to people that it was in the best long-term interests of the country to reverse growth or to do away with growth.
Okay,
I think you have to offer
quickly,
hope in
Alex Salmond.
politics,
Sorry.
not just stagnation.
Well, I've got some sympathy for the questioner in the sense that, of course, GDP doesn't necessarily measure the quality of living and is a restricted measurement in that sense. But there's no doubt, of course, that if you have an economy in the sort of recession that we're currently in, with, in real terms, 350,000 people in Scotland unemployed, then that in itself affects the quality of life of all these people and their families. And if we take the Scottish economy towards full employment, like other small economies like the Netherlands or Switzerland, then that will improve the quality of life for many Scottish families.
Right, all right. Alistair Darling, as I recall, the environment gets a mention in the last paragraph of Labour's manifesto.
Well, it actually gets rather more than that. I think that I would disagree with what you say about growth in general terms, but you are quite right to raise the choices that government can make. For example, in infrastructure in Scotland or in the rest of the country, government can choose in transport, for example, whether it builds roads or whether it invests in public transport. That contributes not only to the efficiency of the economy, but also to the quality of the environment. So you're quite right to highlight those matters, and we attach considerable importance to it, considerably more than one paragraph, I think you'll find.
All right. I want to go back to the questioner. What do you think of that?
The question was about the use of GNP as an indicator of a country's well-being, and I don't think anybody really answered that. I know it's the accepted measure of a country's well-being at the moment, but I don't think it's a very relevant one to under a lot of circumstances.
Okay, let's get some more questions. The gentleman in the second row with his hand up, yes.
Alex Salmond raised a very important point on business rates and the level of business rates in Scotland. I would like to ask Alistair Darling, what are the Labour Party's plans for business rates in Scotland? It appears to be something they're not saying much on at the moment, and it's a very important issue for businesses in Scotland.
It is a very important matter because Scottish businesses have been paying more than they should be in business rates for the last 2 or 3 years.
More than that. Much more than that.
Well, they've been paying more, but I'm thinking of in the immediate past. And we think that the Scottish business rates must be reduced because it is one of the burdens that is being placed upon small businesses. One of the many burdens that they feel that it inhibits them from expanding and from competing. I don't think anybody has been quiet about it. I think what we would like to do is to return to a situation where local authorities fix the level rather than having a unified basis, unified tax right across the board, because I think that is much, much more efficient, it's much fairer, and local businesses can be in direct contact with the authorities with which they have to deal.
Let's get some more views from the audience. The man in the third row in the grey with his hand up.
Mr. Salmond, imagine for a moment I'm a director of a multinational company. Persuade me to settle in Scotland, a high-tax Scotland, instead of a northern English city which seeks a high unemployment.
Well, given that we're not going to have a high-tax Scotland, I shouldn't have too much trouble. But you probably noticed an opinion poll in International Business in Scotland published last weekend, which showed a majority of international business working in Scotland at the present moment in favour of constitutional change and 25% in favour of independence in Europe. Already the international business community, like the small business community in Scotland, are moving towards constitutional change. The only people who aren't are a handful of Ian Lang's Tory friends in what's left of the old captains of Scottish industry.
All right.
Virtually all of whom are members of the Tory party and have had their arms put up their back by Ian Lang over the last few weeks.
All right, I want to go on to our next...
Can I come in on that business rates question? Because it really is very important. The fact is, Alistair Darling said he wanted to see business rates come down. The Labour Party's policy is to remove the uniform business rate plans that we have, to allow local authority rates to rip, to let every local authority set its own level, to abolish capping, so that business would once again be the milch cow of local authorities. We are the first party who has done something to bring business rates down. They have been too high for too long because local authorities in Scotland spend 30% more than they do in England and Wales.
All right, I'm sorry to cut
we
across
have
you,
brought
but
nearly £400 million in to bring them down, and we're going to get them down further.
All right, I do want to move on. I'm sure we'll come back to business rates in the course of this discussion. I want to go on to our next question, which comes from Bob Burgess. Mr. Burgess, what's your question?
Good evening, panel. Under the last Labour government, the nationalised British Steel Corporation was costing £1 million a day. In an independent Scotland, what would it cost the Scottish taxpayers to support a nationalised industry? Mr. Salmond, if you could answer that.
Well, it depends if you take the view of whether Ravenscraig and DL and the Scottish steel plants are inherently profitable or not. You see, it's only a couple of years since everyone in this panel would have agreed that Ravenscraig was a highly productive, profitable plant which was doing a tremendous job within the context of British Steel. And I think there might even be still some agreement in some of the people in this panel that British Steel are closing Ravenscraig, not because it's not productive and profitable, but because they want to shift the production elsewhere within that company. So I would argue very strongly that a Scottish steel company would have an outstanding future because of the productivity of the workforce at Ravenscraig and DL.
All right, can we come back to the question, which is how much would it cost?
Well, the point is I'm making, if it's a profitable, productive company, then you don't need a subsidy to run such a company. Where you'd need to spend money, of course, is in an investment plan to upgrade the facilities, both of Ravenscraig and of DL, to make it competitive in the marketplace.
And that would cost you what?
Well, the plan that we are proposing involves investment of £200 million, which is taken in our budget proposals. What we are actually proposing is very similar in some ways to what British Steel are proposing to do. The difference is that they intend to push investment into Lackenby in the northeast of England. We intend to put it into DL and Ravenscraig in central Scotland.
Charles Kennedy, if it's such a good idea, why aren't you proposing to invest £200 million in Scottish steel?
You know, at the last election, I remember sitting on a programme like this with Alec when we were discussing the whole future of the steel industry in Scotland at that point, and arguing and being very much criticised by him on that programme that really, as the government were going down the privatisation route, we were arguing in '87 that what they should do is have a separate Scottish company, not tied to British Steel, which could compete in the marketplace, let Scottish money be put behind it, let the talents and the abilities to win market share of Scottish workers in the international marketplace in that way. And of course that was shot down at that point. The tragedy is, if Scottish Steel had been given the opportunity to become Scottish Steel properly in that way and compete, it wouldn't have been the death by 1,000 cuts that we've seen by British Steel. And I'm afraid to say the fault ultimately for that lies with the government for the method of privatisation. But I do not believe now that it is honest with, I'm not accusing Alec of dishonesty, but I don't think for those of us who have looked at this that it would be honest to pretend to those dependent on the steel industry that somehow blanket nationalisation sometime after April the 10th is going to be the saviour.
Charles, Ian Lang.
I sympathise with that attitude of Charles Kennedy. It would have been nice if we could have privatised steel industry in Scotland in a separate Scottish company, and we looked at it very closely at the time. But the fact was that when the steel industry was nationalised, like every other Scottish company that's been nationalised, control was taken south into one big integrated London-based organisation. The independent freestanding Scottish companies were scrambled together and rearranged by product rather than by company, and it simply wasn't possible to unscramble that in a way that would have created a viable Scottish steel industry. And I don't know why Alex Salmond is contemplating nationalising it and spending £200 million on it, because if he genuinely believes that an independent Scotland would be a Scotland in Europe, he knows very well that the Treaty of Paris would prevent us from putting any investment into the steel industry. We would be precluded from that by that treaty from doing so.
Tell that to France, Spain and all the other countries which have the steel industry in public ownership at the present moment. They have the steel industry in public ownership, do they not?
It really is a bit off of Ian Lang to pretend that because British Steel was nationalised, the government was a completely helpless spectator. This government, Ian Lang's government, owned British Steel until they privatised it. And if he was that concerned about the level of investment or anything else about British Steel, he could have done something about it, and he didn't. It was then privatised, and British Steel, despite the work and the efforts of every single person involved in the complex, have slowly run down that plant and betrayed the trust and the loyalty of the workers who work there. And it really, for Ian Lang to blame nationalisation or anything else is a complete nonsense.
Okay, thank you
now,
for that.
Can I just, because I want to directly answer the question, because I think it is a bit of a con of the SNP to say, if only you nationalise the Scottish steel industry, then everything will be fine. It won't. You can't subsidise it because the EC won't let you. But what you do have to do is to look to the future, the thin slab technology that would allow the industry to expand in Scotland. You can't just pretend that what has happened hasn't happened. To look to the future of Lanarkshire, you've got to do a lot more than simply utter the word nationalisation at only £200 million and everything will be hunky-dory. It certainly won't, and it's no wonder that the Ravenscraig stewards don't accept that either.
I want to go back to the questioner, Bob Burgess. What do you make of the answers?
Well, it seems a bit of a hodgepodge to me, but we don't really know what the EEC situation is with steel. You know, are there higher people in Europe saying that there's a plant got to go in the UK? You know, we're really getting the truth as to why Ravenscraig is closing.
Alex Salmond, briefly.
Well, the EC position is quite simple. There's a number of steel industries within the community, like France and Spain and Ireland, which are within the public sector. There's no bar on a public sector steel industry. You're not allowed to subsidise the steel industry, but I'm not arguing for subsidies. I'm arguing for an investment programme to give Scottish steel a chance.
All right.
It's very, well, just one point, Eddie. It's very interesting indeed that Ian Lang argues that the problems with Scottish steel were through public ownership from London. It's argued from this direction that the problems with Scottish steel are private ownership from London. Notice the common factor is London control. Isn't it time we had some Scottish control?
Okay. Now, part of the question was obviously pertaining to tax. I want to move slightly off steel for a moment, pertaining to tax. And obviously that's a concern of most taxpayers, just what kind of tax will be levied after the election. Can we have some points and questions on that in particular? The man in the front row with the bright blue rosette on. Yes, sir.
Alistair Darling mentioned just briefly the convention tax proposal. We believe that the proposals have been drafted for the Scottish Convention, but nobody has seen them.
Okay.
Are they not going to be published before the election?
Okay, we have dealt with this. In fact, we had it on last week's programme about the Constitution, so I'm not going to chuck it back to Alistair Darling just yet, although I'm sure he's keen to come in with an answer. Let's have some more points pertaining to tax if we can. Right up at the back, let's go up to the gentleman right at the back in the centre, in the back row with his hand up. Yes, sir.
Would the panel support the abolition of Class 4 national insurance? Because this is a tax.
National insurance, Charles Kennedy.
Insurance.
Yeah.
Well, we take the view on national insurance contributions that you should merge them with income tax. I mean, we pay them, and that it would be a far more simplified tax system as a result. So we would say that the answer to the national insurance thing is actually to simply have it merged into one system.
All right. Ian Lang?
I don't see any great merit in abolishing it. If you abolished them, you would have to raise the money in other ways, either through direct income tax or through some other kind of tax.
Very briefly, Alex Salmond.
Well, no, the merger of national insurance and income tax is a good system. It will ensure a progressive move through the entire tax bands. It's also the way in which we're going to pay for our low basic rate of 20 pence in the pound for the first £3,000 of taxable income.
All right, Alistair Darling.
I think the important point that most people look at is what they get at the end of the day. And frankly, I think that national insurance and tax, it has to be taken together. I don't think you can divorce the two. The important thing is to look at the tax burden, which of course has increased under the last 13 years, and also to look and see who pays tax and how much, which is why we wanted to take 740,000 people out of paying tax.
Okay.
That seemed to me to be a very good way of helping people.
Thank you for that. Let's go back to the question. Are you happy with those answers?
No, I don't think they understand. Class 4 national insurance, it applies to the self-employed only, and it's an extra extra insurance on the self-employed.
All right.
Solely.
I want to take another point from the man who's just in front of you there. Yes, sir.
See, I don't think you can just skip over the issue of Ravenscraig on a programme about the Scottish economy. And my question is about, the issue of Ravenscraig to the panel. Well, firstly, would the panel agree that the situation we find the Scottish steel industry in is a direct result of the policies of the Tory government? And secondly, I'd like to ask each of the panel, if they were elected, what would their policy be towards Ravenscraig on the 10th of April? Would they stop the closure of Ravenscraig and give those workers in that plant an assurance about their future?
All right, we haven't skipped over steel with respect. I mean, we have spent quite a long time talking about it, but let's get an answer to your question on Ravenscraig. Yes or no answers. Charles Kennedy.
First part, obviously the government were the one who legislated for privatisation the way they did it, and so they carry the substantial part of the responsibility. And we would still look, after April the 10th, any position we'd be in to influence events in this respect, to try and see if Scottish Steel could be constituted as a viable competitive unit in its own right.
Alex Salmond.
The answer is yes. The assets must be removed from the hands of British Steel. That's the only way that Scottish Steel can be given a chance for the future.
Okay.
Whether it's in public ownership or a joint venture with the private sector, the assets must be taken out the death grip of Bob Scully and British Steel.
All right, equally briefly, Alistair Darling.
Yes, a joint venture is essential to look at Ravenscraig's future and to branch out into new technology. The difference is, I think, between us and the Nationalists, I think we will be in a position to do something on the 10th of April. They were too busy negotiating separation with England.
What happens if they want to sell for?
So I think the mistake that all parties make is assuming that if they were in government, they would be able to take decisions on the running of an industry better than the people who have spent their lives running that industry and who know it inside out. I believe that decisions on management should be left to management and not taken by government.
Okay. Now, let's move on to our next question. It comes from Liam Bannon. Mr. Bannon.
Good evening. What are the party's proposals for dealing with the scandal of low pay, which is keeping thousands of Scottish working people in the poverty trap?
Alistair Darling.
Well, we've a number of proposals. Firstly, dealing with the question of low pay, we propose to put into place a national minimum wage of £3.40 an hour. And anticipating what Ian Lang is going to say about it, perhaps I can say this, that the Conservatives are the same people that told us in the 1970s that equal pay for men and women would be a disaster and that it would lead to job losses. It didn't. Every other successful economic country has a national minimum wage which enables people to be paid a proper rate for the job, and in turn they pay taxation. It works in other countries, it will work in this country, because quite frankly low wage and poverty does not work in any successful economy as well. Now, I think the other thing to bear in mind is that those who are not technically waged, but those who are in receipt of benefits, must be also be looked after. And I'd mention only one category in particular, those who aged 16 and 17 who have done nothing at all. They have nothing to offend anybody, and yet the government denies them receiving benefit. The issue of low pay and poverty has got to be tackled as a first priority of the next Labour government.
Alistair Darling, where are the companies who are paying these low wages, who presumably are struggling to make ends meet in the middle of a recession? Where are these companies going to get the money to pay this minimum wage?
Well, we've made the point that when we introduce the legislation, we will make sure that it is introduced in such a way that it will not be a major traumatic shock.
How does that happen?
Well, it is in the same way as equal pay was introduced in the 1970s. A national minimum wage will be introduced. And there is no other way round tackling low wages and poverty pay.
But the point I'm putting to you is the wage bill of these companies is presumably going to shoot up rather dramatically overnight. How are they expected to stay in business?
It will not shoot up overnight because you introduce the legislation in such a way that you do not get that sort of traumatic shock.
How do you do that?
Well, you quite easily, in the sense that you can phase in any legislation to ensure that it does not cause traumatic shock. And indeed, the experience is in other European countries where legislation has been introduced, it has not led to the job losses that the government has anticipated. Indeed, quite the reverse, because if you look at the employment record of other European countries, Germany or for example, you will find that they have not suffered the economic catastrophe that we have suffered in this country.
Alex Salmond, where do you stand on low pay?
Oh, we would go for the minimum wage at £3.40, which is half adult medium earnings over the first 4-year term of the Scottish Parliament. Now, can I just perhaps help Alistair out here? I mean, it will have very substantial economic effects indeed, and there's no point in dodging around that. It's going to mean higher prices because most of the people who have been paid poverty wages are in the service industries. And all of us who use the services, who go for a meal in the restaurant, whatever, will find that there will be an increase in the restaurant bill. But it does have two very substantial advantages. One, that it stops the bad employer driving out the good employer. The people who pay poverty wages driving out the decent employer. That is put to an end. The second thing, of course, is it expands the economy and puts more money into the pockets of more people. And so business responds to an expanded economic environment.
What will its effect on inflation be?
Well, there will be a rise in inflation. There will be a short-term rise in inflation, but there will be a rise in inflation. But most estimates say that the impact of introducing a decent wage for all people will actually be an increase in employment over the medium term. So it's not just socially just, it's economically sensible as well.
Ian Lang, why don't you introduce a minimum wage?
Well, I noticed that both the parties who support it admit that it would lead to job losses. They admit that it would lead to higher inflation, and it undoubtedly would. I think the way to tackle low pay is to help companies to become competitive, to help them win new markets, to help them to grow and expand and raise the living standards of their employees in that way. The fact is that many people would lose their jobs. Many people who are willing to work for a relatively low wage rather than not to work at all.
But after
I have spoken spoken to them today in my own constituency, going round factories and shops and other places. And I think the way in which the government can help is to make sure that the tax thresholds are kept high and that tax rates are kept low. That is why we want to bring in a 20% lower rate for the first 2,000. And that is why we want to work towards a low tax rate, a basic rate of 20 pence in the pound.
But after 13 years and 2 recessions, what's that doing for the low paid?
It's doing a very great deal for them. You will remember when we came into power, income tax was at 33 pence in the pound. We have brought it down to 25 pence in the pound. We have created many more jobs in the economy, and as a result, people are in employment with a chance of rising through the company, raising their pay levels, and benefiting accordingly.
Charles Kennedy.
We think that the preferable way to go about this, to tackle a very real problem that the gentleman's raised, is in fact not just to talk of minimum wage, but instead to talk of minimum income. There are those in work, low-paid work, who suffer this horrendous problem as a result of the tax and benefit system that we've got, that a very small increase in their level of income, the attendant loss in benefit is leaving them worse off. Now, that is a terrible trap into which to get caught. We would like to integrate tax and benefits. As a result of that, you can specifically target help, not just as the minimum wage does on those already in employment, but equally importantly, those who aren't in employment or are stuck in low-paid employment and unable to help themselves up because of the loss of benefits that accompany it. So that, we think, has got to be the target, and a strengthening, incidentally, in the low-paid sectors that Alec rightly referred to, of the wages council structure.
We're almost out of time now, and I want to go around and get some more points from the audience. Points if you can, because we probably won't have time for questions. The woman in the spectacles in the black, yes.
Oh, me?
Yes.
Oh, well, sorry, I had a question, but it's really this point about low pay. I mean, most of the low-paid people in this country, in the UK and Scotland, are actually women, and I'm actually quite interested to know what the political parties would actually do to address pay inequalities between men and women, which, despite legislation, are still huge.
OK, we may try and get an answer from the panel on that. Let's go right to the back row, and the man with the white shirt. Yes, sir.
Is it true that if the Tories win the next election, God forbid, that they'll scrap all the wages councils?
Yes or no, Ian Lang? You can give a one-word answer to that.
Well, we have already scrapped some of the wage councils for precisely the same reason. They do inhibit negotiation between workers, but we've no immediate plans to scrap any of the others.
Right, let's get some more points from the audience. The man in the third row in the blue jacket, and I think a red and blue tie. Yes, sir.
How are people going to encourage elderly people who depend on savings to continue to save and live off the interest when Labour are planning to tax savings?
No, we're not.
All right, Alistair Darling, very briefly.
No, we're not. John Smith made that absolutely clear in the budget that he announced last week. We're not proposing to taxing savings at all, because we accept that many, many pensioners depend on those savings because of the meagre pensions this government has given them over the last 13 years.
Alex Salmond, briefly.
Well, on the point about low wages, I mean, Ian Lang says he was speaking to low-paid workers in his constituency today. I've got the feeling they'll be speaking to him decisively in 2 weeks' time.
All right, you made
decisively.
that point.
Ian Lang?
I think the questioner is absolutely right. The fact is that the Labour Party is going to have to tax right across the board to begin to pay for its £35 billion spending programme. And John Smith may have temporarily set aside the earlier pledge that he had to tax pensioners' savings, but the fact is that he will bring it back, because otherwise he cannot begin to pay for his programme.
Charles Kennedy, you've got 10 seconds.
Fresh thinking, you've got to integrate our tax and benefits system, because low pay is a scandal, but poverty, whether you're in work or out of work, is an even broader social scandal.
Charles Kennedy, thank you. That's where we have to leave it tonight. Join us next week when we'll be in Aberdeen to debate health on the last Friday of this election campaign. Join us then. In the meantime, the election news this Friday, John Foster on the campaign trail.